What's up, horror fans? We are the Lassercast. Danny and nope, that way. Nope, that way. Pete, down in Texas, and to my left, uh, and we're here continuing with our James Wan-A-THON, talking about Insidious Chapter 2 from 2013, a direct sequel to the 2010 film that we talked about last week. This is my second time watching it. Literally just finished watching it about 10 minutes ago. If you haven't seen it, it's streaming on the Roku channel. Pete, this is your first time watching it, right?
It is.
So what were your first thoughts? Especially since we liked I know you liked Insidious so much. Um, what did you think of this as a was this a worthy sequel in your opinion?
Oh yeah. I think it's a worthy sequel. It's a great direct continuation from the first movie. It doesn't feel like a rehash. It feels like a continuation of that story. You could easily watch this one right after you just finished Insidious Part One, and I think it's just because they're doing what good horror sequels should do. They're like building upon the mythology.
You mentioned the phrase direct, like it directly takes off of part one. This is one of the best, in my opinion, direct sequels out there because there's hundreds of sequels
Right.
to horror movies, especially. But very rarely do you get this is how part one ended, pick it right up in part two. Like Halloween 2 is a good example of that. Um, I think Friday the 13th, parts like 3 and 4 kind of do that also.
Right.
But this is definitely one of the better examples of that, directly from where part one ended. You can, like you said, just you could watch it as a continuation, not even as a separate movie. It's all the same cast. There's really only one major new cast member,
Yeah.
and that's Steve Coulter, who plays Carl.
Oh yeah.
But aside from that, it's the entire cast of the first movie, and they're pretty much just continuing with how part one ended. In fact, I think the movie opens with, um, uh, oh god, Elise's body in the chair from where she
Yes.
was killed as like the big jump scare ending to part one.
Well, for this one, it does have that scene in the past first, where you see Elise and she's young, but then it cuts to that scene, and I got a little thrown off with that scene with Elise when she was young because I like that actress, and that actress did a great job, sort of mimicking Lin Shaye's sort of movements and the way that she would talk and her inflection, but you could tell that it was like Lin Shaye's voice dubbed over her voice, so that kind of took me out of it a little bit.
It I It's funny. I just read that on IMDb in the trivia section how they filmed it with that actress, and then they had Lin Shaye dub it over. And I I think what happens later in the movie, like because like you said, the first time I saw this, I was like, oh, that's interesting that we're seeing the past version of Josh, like where he meets Elise. But like I didn't realize they were going to do that. But then where it comes back later in the film, I really appreciate that scene.
They show previous versions of other characters too. They show Carl when he's younger. They show Josh's mom when she was younger, and I don't think they dubbed their voices.
And Josh's mom, the young version of her, is played by Jocelyn Donahue, who was the star of, I don't know if you ever saw House of the Devil.
I have not.
Oh, Joe Bob did an episode of House of the Devil. So if you want to go on Shutter and watch that version of it, it is one of the best modern horror films. It's such a good, creepy, like haunted house cult movie. She was also um the mom in Doctor Sleep.
Yeah,
Yeah,
she's
Avra's
Avra's
mom.
mom.
Yeah,
Oh
it's
shit!
Jocelyn Donahue.
James Wan and Leigh Whannell, they're the ones that wrote this screenplay, and then of course James Wan directed it, which is why it's part of our James Wan-A-thon. But to me, that's what makes this more appealing than the first movie because it's like they took their story of this woman in this like bride outfit, and they're like, no, there's more to it than that.
Yeah,
And boy, does this have like a feeling of like Psycho to it. This movie.
It has. I feel like we always have this happen on this channel. It's like, did Pete see this horror movie? Have you ever seen? Because I don't want to ruin it, but have you ever seen Sleepaway Camp?
Oh, the thing of Sleepaway Camp, the big spoil has been spoiled for me for a long time.
Well, that big spoiler is set up at the beginning in a scene that is very reminiscent of the scene where the mother is screaming at, yeah, where she's screaming at young Parker, and like like he takes the wig off, and you realize that it's a little boy. That scene is it. There's a very good Sleepaway Camp reference. You mentioned Psycho. Yeah, there's a lot of that in this film too. Really creepy.
There absolutely is something in quite a few horror movies where you have this weird relationship between the mother and the son and how it like warps the son. Psycho is obviously like the A1 example. It's like the
Of course.
clearest example. Um, but there's other weird things where you have like an abusive family member, like whatever happened to baby Jane, like sort of this idea of like a younger, more innocent person being kind of corrupted by an abusive older person, and that abusive older person usually themselves were abused by someone, like a
Yeah.
husband left them, and we see that in the Bates Motel show. You know, and I haven't seen all the Psycho sequels, so I don't know if they go. One of them is a prequel too, right? One of the Psycho.
Psycho 4 is a prequel that shows like young Norman growing up.
And so in this, they're able to take this character from the first movie that is just this sort of horrifying image, this black bride, and then kind of humanize him to where by the very end of this movie, you kind of feel bad for Parker. I almost feel like this movie could almost be the third act of the first movie, with the exception of introducing Carl and his dice, which is that's kind of like a new thing. And that's like, okay, well, we have a part two. Here's a new character. Like you literally could just go. That could have been the third act of the first movie.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like Josh is now stuck in the further, and we have to get him out. You know, and there's an imposter in his body.
And I know you're a huge Patrick Wilson fan.
Yes.
He was so good in this movie. Like
Yes.
we both kind of mentioned how like he's kind of like this standoffish, aloof husband in part one, partly because for most of part one, he doesn't remember a lot of what happened. So like he's kind of out of the loop. Here, he's like playing this dual role where he's trapped in the further, but then he's also playing uh the black bride. uh,
Right.
and the way that they do the makeup where they make him look like he's aging. and,
Yep.
and you brought up Psycho. There's a few scenes where he's sitting with like what looks like a shawl around him, so
Yeah.
he's almost dressed in it. He's almost sitting there. He looks aging, and he looks very feminine because he's got like the shawl wrapped around him, kind of like a grandma.
Yes.
Oh, he's so good in this movie.
You bring up my probably my favorite part in the whole movie is when Carl goes to see him. He's there and he's got his teacup in one hand. He's got something behind his back, and he says, "What's behind your back, Josh?" And then he says, or "What's behind your back, Parker?" He says, "Ask your dice." Right?
Yeah,
That's I feel to me that's the best scene in the whole movie. And he rolls the dice.
so tense, so
Yeah,
tense. And I
yeah,
felt like, what's interesting is we talked about in Insidious how Wan uses jump scares so well. This
yes,
movie I felt was a little bit less on the jump scares,
right.
and it was more about building that tension.
Yep. And boy, did they build up that tension with that sequence where you had all the victims of the Black Bride underneath those
Oh,
sheets.
when they're in the hospital.
Yeah.
Oh man,
And
yeah,
and did you? I was wondering if you thought this too. When they showed Parker as a little boy, but he was dressed up like a girl, and you just saw in the hospital, you kind of saw like the back of him, and it looked like a doll. Didn't that look like Annabelle?
it did. And even at the very end, when they knock on the door, the little girl who comes in is holding a big doll, and I was like,
Yep. I wouldn't mind if these universes kind of crossed over with each other. I mean, of course, Patrick Wilson is a different character in both of them, but
I just rewatched part 2. I really enjoy this movie. I don't think it's as good as the first movie, only because I think the first movie is a lot scarier.
I agree.
But I do think this is an incredibly worthy sequel. It is it just like Conjuring 2 was an incredibly worthy sequel to the first one. And I can't wait to rewatch parts 3 and 4 also.
Nice, man. Yeah, I'm super excited about that. I just love James Wan. This has been a great little event, getting to talk about his movies and get to watch them for the first time. You were talking about Charlotte getting upset about watching Dead Silence. Pepper and I just watched Silver Bullet. She got kind of freaked out by some of the werewolves' kills. We just recorded a review of that yesterday,
Nice.
but I'm going to put that up a little later in our month of September, because we got a lot of stuff coming out on this channel this month. We have the rest of James Wan-A-THON going up to Malignant, and then we're also interested in that one short story that's going to be a movie on September 3rd. We Need to Do Something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's potentially 2 very big interviews coming up that we're trying to set up. I don't want to spoil them just in case they don't happen.
Yeah.
But, my birthday is September 29th. And if we can get these interviews, or at least one of them before September 29th, that's going to make my whole 39 for me.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so we got a lot of shit coming up on the Lasercast. Danny, as always, it's been a pleasure talking about Insidious and James Wan with you. And we'll be back next time to talk about Dead Silence.